Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, DIY Data Center Automation Deep Dive, Challenges and Opportunities for CSPs, Enterprises, and Cloud Providers, sponsored by Juniper. Before we begin, I will cover a few housekeeping items. On the left-hand side of your screen is the Q&A. If you have any questions during the webcast, please type your question into the Q&A box and submit your questions to our speakers. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you, we may follow up via email. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget. Here you can find answers to common questions. A copy of today's slide deck is available for download in the green resource list widget. Near the end of today's presentation, please take 1 minute to complete the survey that's open on your screen. Your feedback is extremely helpful. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available about 1 day after the event and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier today. I would now like to turn the event over to Light Reading's contributing editor, Terry Sweeney. Terry?
Thanks, Barbara, and let me add my own welcome to this DIY Data Center Automation Deep Dive. Terry Sweeney here, contributing editor with Light Reading, and I will be moderating today's discussion. To build or to buy, that's been a question in telecom and technology management for decades now. Whether you have 10 servers or 10,000, the landscape has changed with the advent of cloud computing, virtualization, AI and machine learning. All of it has transformed network management and made the question of buy versus build a lot more complicated. Thankfully, today's speakers, Gorkam Yiyit of Analysys Mason and Arun Gandhi with Juniper Networks, will really dig into this issue, especially as it pertains to how much of your data center operations you automate. Today's webinar is also a departure from the usual presenter with a PowerPoint setup that you may be accustomed to. Gorkam and Arun will have more of a conversation really about the findings of a recent study that Juniper commissioned and Analysys Mason conducted. Gorkam and his team talked to communication service providers, cloud service providers, and enterprise customers, and the goal there was to peel back the layers of these different customer segments with regard to their thinking, their planning, and their spending where automation in the data center is concerned. But as Barbara mentioned, we want to hear from you, our attendees, as well, while Gorkam and Arun chat. Please send us your question using that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, which we'll address later in the program. So that's probably enough logistics for now. Arun Gandhi of Juniper, let's start with you. Talk to us why Juniper commissioned the study in the first place. What insights were you looking for here?
Thanks, Terry, and it's great to be on the panel with both you and Gorkam. And to answer your question, Terry, as you know, data center networking has become more complex in the last few years, and the added complexity needs to be managed. The tools we've used before to manage them no longer apply. Analysys Mason conducted an extensive survey for us last year, and that was focused on the SP data center automation strategy. And one of the key findings was that in-house automation tooling is prevalent among organizations, and most of them face cost and scalability challenges with their custom DIY automation tools. In addition, in-house created automation requires developers and network engineers to spend large amounts of time and efforts building, testing, integrating custom DIY automation tools. The maintenance and the continuous development and improvement of such tools can become more expensive over the life cycle. And also last survey showed that CSPs with large numbers of in-house DIY automation tools on average have higher cost bases than their peers that rely mainly on vendor automation solutions. So we kicked off this survey project with Analysys Mason once again to develop an understanding of in-house DIY automation data centers activities, the use cases, and the pain points. And this time we did it across all segments. So it's like communication service providers, the enterprises, and cloud providers. And the survey results are very insightful and provide meaningful context to the mind of the data center leader.
Gorkum, let's turn to you now, if we could. Help us understand a bit about how you went about collecting data for the data center study itself. What was your methodology here?
Sure. So we carried out an online survey with a total of 96 organizations. And these are mainly from three segments, including enterprises, cloud service providers, and telecom operators. And as Arun mentioned, our objective was to gain an in-depth understanding of the in-house DIY automation activities and reveal the main motivations, use cases, and then the challenges behind them. So we surveyed a large number of enterprises from a wide range of sizes and verticals. You can see these on the left-hand side. And the majority of these enterprises, they own between 25 to 50 data centers. But even the smallest ones, they have at least one or two. Our focus on the cloud service providers was not on the major players, such as AWS, Google, and Microsoft, but rather the smaller scale, more regional type of players providing cloud and data center services. For the telecom operators, these were typically the large tier 1 operators with extensive mobile and fixed network and the data center assets. And in addition to this online survey, we also conducted deep dive interviews with senior decision makers from each of these segments. And you can also see on the right-hand side that this was a global study with a good balance between the Western and Eastern sides of the world. And finally, in terms of the titles and responsibilities of the respondents, we have a very balanced mix of senior executives who are in charge of their data center strategy and then transformation of their organizations, and also the technical staff from the production floor, such as network engineers and operations people who perform the day-to-day operation activities in the data centers.
So tremendous diversity among your sample, not to mention like heavy hitters on every continent from the data center realm. Let's dive in then with some of the key findings from the research. Also curious about any similarities you may have seen among the key drivers or the trends for data center strategies across these segments.
Of course. So one of the key findings from our research is that the level of automation in data center networks is very low across the board. And we were quite surprised by this because many of the companies we talked to stated that their data center network automation strategies are driven by ensuring customer experience, security, and business continuity. And often, automating these network operations is one of the key pillars of their digital transformation strategy. So despite this strategic importance of data center network automation, companies are struggling to make progress in it. And the main problem they are facing is that they find it difficult to achieve reliable and repeatable automation in a cost-efficient manner. As part of this research, we had a deep dive into how companies are building automation in their DC networks. And we found that the majority of the DC network operations today rely on a fragmented set of in-house built DIY tools and solutions. This indicates that the current DIY-based approach to DC network automation is not delivering the results companies desire, and there's a strong and urgent need for rethinking these DIY automation strategies. So if you zoom in on the level of automation achieved today, we see some differences between the operational areas and also the type of segments. So we asked companies to assess their automation levels across the key operational processes, including day zero planning and design, day one deployment and configuration, and day two and plus ongoing operations such as monitoring, troubleshooting, and so on. We see that the companies, the more progress has been made in day two operations, which are often a priority for companies because day two has a direct impact on customer experience and company's reputation. So think about the outages and SLAs. So this is an important area, but if you look at overall automation levels, it is still low. And there are several challenges causing this, and we'll circle back to that. We found that day zero automation is the lowest, and many companies in our research reported that they're finding the data center design processes highly challenging and difficult to automate. When looking at the segments, cloud providers are the most automated among all three, and this is expected because they need automated data centers and operations to stay competitive. However, compared to the levels of automation we see in major public cloud companies, these providers seem to be lagging behind, and this could be a major risk to their business. Enterprises, on the other hand, are a mixed bag, but we identified mainly two types. Some enterprises mainly see their data centers as cost centers, and they tend to limit investments and usually outsource the operations to third parties. But there's also other type of enterprises who consider their data centers as strategic assets and key part of their business and digital journeys. So this attitude and focus makes a big difference in the automation investments, and those that place more strategic importance on their data centers also make the more progress in DC network automation. And finally, the telecom operators achieved the lowest level of automation in all areas. Last year, as Arun mentioned, we collaborated on another research that focused on the state of operators' DC automation. And the key finding was that operators are struggling a lot with technology and operational silos and the complexity in their data centers. And this is hindering their ability to automate. And now we see that there's considerable gap between operators and other digital companies in terms of automation. And this might have major implications to their 5G and edge service ambitions.
Gorkem, I think it would be helpful if you could talk about some of the main challenges that are contributing to the low levels of automation in data center networks.
Absolutely. So our survey showed that there are three common pain points in DC networks today. First is the multi-vendor support and integration, especially in telecom operators and also in the large size enterprises and to some extent cloud providers as well. This is a major challenge. These companies often have to use multiple vendor proprietary management and automation solutions, and most often they use it in addition to their in-house grown DIY tools. And all these disparate systems result in high operational complexity and present a significant challenge for automation. And this gets even worse for operators and cloud providers that provide managed hosting services in which they operate customer networks, and each of these networks come with a different set of vendor technology environments. So overall, this is the top barrier and a pain point for automation. The other pain points are actually interrelated. The many companies believe that the automation tools that are available in the market are not adequate for their automation needs, so they decide to build their own automation tools and solutions. As I mentioned before, there's a huge amount of DIY activities going on in data centers, but then companies also struggle with the cost and the resource limitations of creating and maintaining these DIY automations. So there's a serious concern about the TCO and the ROI of the in-house built solutions, and we're going to talk about it later. And there's also another aspect to consider here, and this regards to the inadequate tooling, because we know that many enterprises adopt technology solutions, but they can't make the most out of them because they don't have the skilled personnel and the right operational processes in place. So even though vendor automation solutions come with many features and functionalities, a lot of them are underutilized or not utilized at all. So it's not always about the technology, but how these technologies are used and the processes are designed around them.
Thanks, Gorkem. Arun, turning back to you, based on Juniper's experience with customers, what part of the data center lifecycle are organizations prioritizing for automation? What are you hearing there?
That's a great question, Terry. Now, if you talk to data center buyers, overwhelmingly, they care about two things. One is the automation, and the other is security. And you see the industry has changed, where the past was defined by architecture, which boxes do you deploy and where, what protocols to use to connect them. The future is defined by operations. And we aren't scaling bandwidth so much as we are scaling up operations. And let me point out that the entire industry has made automation a focus for at least the last 15 years. But despite the millions of hours collectively poured into this pursuit, most operations outside of the large cloud properties are still manual. And I think Gorkem alluded to those. If you are generous, maybe you would acknowledge how hard it is. And if you are more cynical, maybe you will cite the DevOps Borat when he says, to make error is human, to propagate the error to all servers in an automatic way is DevOps. And it's not just Borat. Breaking things in networks is almost lore at this point. Ask your customers how comfortable they are pushing to production on Friday. So whether it's a supply chain issues or the Great Resignation or any other half a dozen or so dynamics playing across the industry, the fact of the matter is the old way of doing things is dying. The trends towards automation is important, but it is now about developing familiarity with the new host of methods more conducive to automated operations.
Gorkum, turning back to you for a moment. Let's dig in a little bit more around the extent of data center automation, particularly with regard to this whole build versus buy question that we began with. Can you talk about some of the key drivers for organizations here?
Sure. So yes, I mean, the DIY automation is highly prevalent, and we can see, some numbers here. And this, it pretty much applies to all segments we surveyed, that the DIY is the main approach and they're using to their DC network automation. And we're seeing that these DIY activities, they use a broad range of technologies. For instance, the software automation platforms created by, in-house, the DevOps teams is pretty common. And these are not just, the few lines of code, but they are like proper software systems with, many functions and features. And these platforms are typically developed and maintained by sizable amount of developer resources, and also with the support from the skilled engineers and operations staff. And there's also a lot of open source tools-based DIY automation. For example, scripting tools such as Ansible, the agent-based solutions. And these are widely adopted and used by network engineers and operations teams to automate their day-to-day tasks. But these are typically used in a firefighting mode as opposed to a consistent automation approach. So many of these are developed in an ad hoc basis. So you can consider them pretty much as band-aids after band-aids to resolve specific problems. And a traditional method of the CLI and the shell scripts are still quite common. And as we've seen, the DC network operations are highly manual. So many companies are relying on these fat finger error-prone approaches to manage their DC networks. And if you look at what is driving these companies to DIY automation, the top driver is the ability to create tailored automation for their specific operational needs. And this is particularly true for cloud service providers because they believe that they keep their technological edge and the competitive differentiation through DIY solutions. Also, the telcos, they love customization, but oftentimes they regret it because it just leads to another snowflake environment among many others they already have. And another top driver is cost savings, but here what they actually mean is CapEx savings. The companies we interviewed during our research highlighted that they find out-of-the-box solutions usually expensive, and they need more cost-efficient and flexible commercial models, such as pay-as-you-go and as-a-service models. However, we are going to talk about it later, but these short-term CapEx savings are actually offset by the OpEx. So there's a big question mark whether these DIY can really save money. And finally, a major challenge that we are seeing in DC networks is the multi-vendor complexity, and a lot of the companies are having difficulties with that, and they're trying to solve these multi-vendor issues through DIY automation. And when we look at the challenges associated with DIY automation, lack of resource and skill availability, and the dependencies on a small set of people who build these automations are the top two pain points. Because the initial development of DIY tools and solutions is just the tip of the iceberg. It also takes a large amount of valuable resources to manage the lifecycle of these tools. This includes testing, integration, maintenance, improvements, security. So these are all highly time and resource consuming activities. And then they face a turnover problem. When the people who built this code and have a deep knowledge of these ad hoc tools and systems, when they leave the organization, it becomes a trouble. And on top of that, there's the skill shortage. The CTO of an insurance company we talked to as part of this research told us that they're having difficulty finding skilled individuals who possess both knowledge of managing data center networks and the ability to code for automation. So the issue is not solely that they're expensive, but also that they're difficult to find and hire. And the final challenge is the ROI and the cost of ownership. And this is no surprise, given what we just discussed about the amount of resources it takes to develop DIY automation and also keep it functioning. So there's actually a large amount of OpEx involved in DIY automation. And most often companies overlook these costs, or simply they are just not fully aware of them, because a lot of these costs are hidden and fly under the radar of senior executives and the decision makers.
Thanks, Gorkem. I think it's safe to say that most of our listeners, if not all, are interested in the actual costs of DIY automation. Can you give us an estimate of the effort and resources required if you were to, in fact, build this yourself?
Of course. So we analyzed two distinct groups of companies in our survey sample. The first group consists of those that heavily rely on DIY automation with minimum use of vendor solutions. And we call them DIY automation reliant, and there are like 11 of them. And there's another set of companies that rely more on the third-party vendor automation solutions than the average, but they still use DIY to a lesser extent. And we call them third-party leaning, and there are like 10 companies in this group. So the first thing that jumped out of this analysis was that there is no significant difference between these groups in terms of their level of automation. So their DC network operations are pretty much automated in the same amount. However, when we look at the level of effort and resources put by the DIY-reliant companies, we see the true cost of DIY automation. As this slide shows, DIY-reliant companies are dedicating a good chunk of their data center budgets to these activities, and it includes the headcount. So there's big OpEx right there. And their network engineers are also facing a heavy burden by these DIY activities, because the majority of the DIYers, they said that the level of effort by the network engineers is very high. And we see the evidence of this here. Most DIYers, actually, more than half of their network engineers and operations staff, they write their own automation scripts in addition to their daily tasks. And almost every day, they are creating and updating these scripts. So this actually begs the question, is it really automation if you need to manage it every day or every week? So if you look at the left-hand side, the companies that have a better balance between the third-party solutions and the DIY can achieve a similar level of automation, but without putting all these, the substantial amount of in-house resources. So this clearly shows that the DIY-heavy approach to automation is inefficient and puts a lot of burden on skilled resources and doesn't deliver a strong ROI.
Arun, let's turn back to you then. What is Juniper's reaction to hearing this information? Any surprises among the findings that Gorkem has just reported?
Thanks, Terry. First of all, I want to thank Gorkem and the team for the great work. Absolutely incredible. Second, as we talk to our customers worldwide, it is very clear that operational complexity is driving up the data center network cost, and automation is needed to reduce this complexity, lower the cost, and improve customer experience and the staff productivity. And DIY automations have significant hidden internal costs and cannot support a rich set of functionalities and scale. I think Gorkem alluded to it in his research data as he presented. And as I remarked earlier, and you've seen, the results are very insightful and reassuring that our Apstra can solve many of the challenges that these automation DIYers have. And just to remind our viewers, Apstra is a multi-vendor intent-based platform with rich features and telemetry. It abstracts control so we can manage a fleet of devices from a single point of control. In a nutshell, Apstra makes it really hard to make mistakes. With data centers being decidedly multi-vendor and oriented around software-defined operations, we do understand the challenges in managing them efficiently. And this research affirms it across all segments.
Gorkem, turning then back to you, what sorts of recommendations do you have then for accelerating data center network automation based on your research and the data that emerged?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, first of all, what this research shows that the level of DC network automation is really low, despite the fact that it is business critical and has an impact on services, customer experience, and company's reputation. So there's an urgent need to take action, especially the CTOs and the CIOs. They need to step up and prioritize investments in this area. A best practice I heard from a fairly automated organization was that they developed a multi-year roadmap to specifically address the DC network automation, and they tied their senior managers' KPIs and the bonuses to their automation objectives. So this is a really good way to drive an organization-wide automation initiative, and this can be adopted by others too. The second, not all DIY automation is bad. In fact, having in-house software development and automation capabilities is a key part of becoming a digital company. However, our research shows that the companies rely too heavily on DIY for their DC network automation, and this is not an efficient way to achieve their automation goals. I recommend that companies rethink their DIY strategies to strike the right balance. So they need to examine their current processes and automation activities to reveal their true costs of DIY and think about switching to a third-party vendor out-of-the-box solutions wherever it makes financial and operational sense. And finally, this means that they need to identify and adopt the right vendor solutions. And based on the key pain points we found on DC network automation today, there are some essential capabilities they need to include in their vendor checklists. Firstly, companies should look for a truly multi-vendor automation platform because many companies struggle with the operational complexity of multi-vendor environments. Second, they need reliable and repeatable automation, which means that they shouldn't have to allocate large amount of resources and worry about people leaving the organization. One way to achieve this is having industry standard best practice automation templates for design, day one and day two activities, so that they're not building snowflake automations, but instead something that can be easily replicated and extended across data centers and operations. And finally, of course, they have to consider the ROI, and this should be based on a holistic analysis that not only includes the short-term CapEx, but also the long-term OpEx associated with the DIY automation activities.
Arun, tell us how viewers can access this research.
Terry, the report is available on Juniper's site, www.juniper.net, and the reports for each segment are going to be there. So for CSPs, the enterprise, and the cloud providers, we will also be sharing the link with all our viewers after the webinar, along with the recording of the webinar. And you can also reach out to your account team, Juniper account team, and Juniper support to get this report in your hands.
Great stuff, Gorkem and Arun. Terrific context setting for the very timely topic of the DIY data center and automation. Your conversation has sparked lots of questions from viewers. Before we go there, I just want to underscore what Arun just mentioned with regard to the follow-up email for this webinar event that will allow you to view this webinar again, pass it on to colleagues. There'll also be an evaluation form in there. We appreciate your feedback. This email will also contain links to the study being discussed here in today's session. So as a reminder to our viewers and listeners, type your questions into that Q&A box. We'll get to as many of your questions as the time allows. Arun, there's a great question here from the audience with regard to definitions and scope of automation. You got into this a bit during your comments, but talk a bit more about whether this includes, is it just the network only? Does it also extend to servers, storage, apps, basically everything from bare metal to virtual network functions? How are you defining that?
Terry, great question. Actually, so how we define is managing automating the entire data center, which includes your switches, your servers, and all the boxes. And certainly, we're looking at basically automation from the operational point of view, as I described in the earlier. And I think also Gorkem has wanted to share some thoughts on this as well, based on the research. So Gorkem, you want to add something to it, please?
No, I mean, I think, yeah, you nailed it. It's when we talk to, and also for the online survey, we define, the data center networks, all the switches, routers, firewalls, and, there's all sorts of, the other L4 and 7 applications in the data center. And of course, I mean, data center networks are not isolated, right? All the server storage applications, they drive, a lot of the automation and requirements on the data centers. So yes, basically for the whole space we talk to in our conversations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, gentlemen. Another question from the audience. Arun, I think this one is for you. Can Apstra support single fabric multi-vendor, say a fabric with switches from vendor A and vendor B?
Yes, the short answer is yes. Apstra certainly support. Apstra is, the only multi-vendor network management solution available today to manage our data center networks, and it is multi-vendor. So you can actually, from a single control point, you can manage your Juniper devices, Cisco, Arista, and your the Sonic boxes as well. So again. Yes, it is, and it was built ground up. Multi-vendor has been our strategy from day one, and we still continue to believe in, and we still continue to go forward with having this, having multi-vendor as part of our key, proposition for data center network management.
Gorkem, I was curious if you might be willing to unpack a bit some of the key use cases for DIY automation for cloud service providers, communication service providers, and enterprises. You alluded to this a bit in your presentation, but talk a bit more about some of the key use cases, if you would.
Yeah, of course. There are some major differences between these segments in terms of their DIY automation use cases. If you start from the communication service providers, CSPs, so their DIY tooling is mainly driven by multi-vendor network operations because they have highly fragmented network equipment, management tools, and the data models. So they need a common layer on top of these to abstract, this underlying complexity. And most often, these DIY tools are built for like monitoring, service intelligence, and the configuration of these multi-vendor environments. And in addition, CSPs do a lot of DIY development for the integration of these multi-vendor devices to the other parts of their automation and management systems, such as like network orchestrators in their telco cloud. But we also discovered that advanced CSPs, they start to look at automation in a more multi-domain way, meaning that they are considering more converged automation for their data centers, WAN, and the rest of their 5G and fixed networks. But so this is still in the early days, but there's definitely growing interest in this area. Cloud service providers, on the other hand, they're highly DIY-driven organizations. And they pretty much build everything in-house. It's just their modus operandi. So they traditionally have a limited use of vendor tools, and they are utilizing all sorts of in-house and open source tools across their operations, from provisioning to monitoring. So there's no specific use case for them, for the DIY automation. It's just the DIY is their primary way to build automation. Enterprises, so the ones we surveyed in this research, showed many similarities to cloud providers in terms of their approach to the DIY automation, and the DIY tools are widespread across all key operational processes. But of course, there are some differences based on the type of enterprises and also their level of technical skills and technology advancements. For instance, some advanced enterprises, they are now building automation to tightly integrate their DC networking resources to their DevOps and CI/CD processes, so that the developers and the product owners, they can consume these resources on demand. We also heard some of the enterprises are going through the cloud repatriation. They are migrating some of their workloads back to their data centers. So they are rebuilding automation for these applications and services. And finally, I would just add, especially in the highly regulated verticals, such as financial services and healthcare, there's a lot of security and compliance-driven automation use cases we saw during our research.
Gorkem, in the conversations that you and your team had with these various customer segments, what changes would they make in retrospect, or if they had to do it all over again, what changes might they make to their in-house tooling? What were some of the common things that you heard from the survey respondents?
Yeah, so it's a great question. One of the most important findings from our research is that almost no one is fully content with their DIY automations, and they would all go back and do things differently. So this is actually quite interesting. And when we look at the most automated CSPs and enterprises, they generally said that they would use third-party vendor solutions instead of like rewriting their DIY tools. And mind you that these are the ones that've been longer on the automation journey, and they experience all sorts of challenges and limitations of DIY automation. So now they're realizing that in a lot of areas, actually, they would be better off with an out-of-the-box solution. Similarly, some of the least automated enterprises and cloud service providers, they're also saying that in retrospect, they would use the right vendor solutions instead of DIY, because they started to acknowledge that it is very difficult for them to get the skill sets and also enough resources to do it by themselves. So there's definitely a growing interest and demand from these type of organizations for out-of-the-box automation. However, one thing I need to mention also, when we look at the most automated cloud service providers, they're a little bit different. Most of them, they're thinking about changing their approach, to building their tools. For instance, they're thinking about dedicating more developer resources, or maybe getting help from external partners, such as outsourcing. So they would still continue to do automation in-house as much as possible, but I would say that best way forward for them actually focusing on what you do best, to achieve competitive differentiation. So concentrate, all the DIY on the strategic areas, but you should offload the rest to vendor solutions, because there is no need to, reinvent the wheel. And, there are some solid solutions in the market that could do the same at the same level, if not better than, the DIY tools. And it would be probably, a much more efficient way to do things.
Thanks for that. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't address the key market trends of cloud and 5G cellular on data center automation. Gorkem, what's your take? I've got a few ideas, but just curious what you see as the impact of cloud and 5G on automation.
Okay, I'll start. So definitely, cloud and 5G, they are the biggest trends. Driving the data center and also the automation strategies today. Let's start with cloud, because the many enterprises and also the CSPs, they're moving their workloads to public clouds and also to SaaS. And in most cases, they're using multiple cloud providers. However, of course, this doesn't mean that they're giving up on their data centers and their private clouds, especially many mission critical services and applications, they're still running on-prem. So overall, this really means that they're operating in increasingly hybrid and multi-cloud environments, and their networking and automation needs are getting more and more complex. And this means that they are facing new requirements and also challenges. And all these are basically, redefining the way they are doing network automation. And also they're thinking about how they're securing these hybrid environments and how they're ensuring service reliability, customer experience, and SLAs. So all of these are now, being rethought with cloud. And in CSPs, cloud and 5G, it pretty much goes hand in hand, because 5G is designed to be cloud native. So there are, the major cloud transformations going on. And cloud-native 5G networks, edge, and advanced enterprise services, they will be all deployed and run across many centralized and distributed data centers. So CSPs need highly automated and agile data center network operations. Otherwise, they won't be able to realize their 5G edge and IoT service ambitions. In the past, the CSPs, they often overlooked their data centers, but now they started to realize that actually their data centers are very critical to their business, and automation in the data centers is quickly moving up in their agenda. By the way, of course, 5G and edge is not only a key driver for CSPs, but also for a wide range of enterprise verticals. Think about manufacturing, automotive, oil and gas, and even in retail, right? So they're looking to drive more automation and better customer experience using the 5G private networks and edge. So again, all this infrastructure, it relies on their data center networks. So automation of these DC networks is an essential element, of their digital transformation. I don't know, Terry, if you have anything more to add on this.
Well, this isn't going to be much of a debate. I'm in violent agreement with just about everything you said. It's clear that cloud obviously is a bit more mature than 5G, but it's also clear that both of these technologies are bringing untold amounts of bandwidth in places we couldn't get them before, not to mention performance and flexibility, but also the complexity that it also begins to introduce. This is going to completely outstrip humans' own individual ability to manage the amount of log data and just to keep current, much less keep things secure and operational. So it seems as if they will hasten actually the adoption of automation. It seems impossible that they can get to the next levels of networking and service and the customer experience that they all want to get to without something more sophisticated than the tools they currently rely on. So let's see. We have another question from the audience. Gorkem, I'd like you to start on this one if you could. What's your position on the evolution to NetOps, the network operations equivalent to DevOps, using an open ecosystem of tooling? The questioner says that this doesn't exclude vendor-specific solutions, but there is a scope boundary what the vendor platforms are supposed to do, e.g. not CI/CD in a box. What's your take on NetOps? Is that something we can expect or should expect?
Definitely. This is an excellent question, and we're definitely seeing a trend towards the NetOps, and I agree with that. So it has to be the open source DIY along with multi-vendor tools, right? So you can't really argue that you can just go with one way and don't think about the other, because as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about recommendations, it's really very key capability for any digital organization to have those in-house software skills, and these are often enriched with the open source and the DevOps kind of tools. So, and also the best practices that we are seeing, for example, from some of the most automated cloud service providers and enterprises, they basically complement the vendor tools and solutions with open source, and also their own developments and their own enrichment of these open source tools. So the ideal way to do it is really to create your DevOps CI/CD pipelines and the chains, your workflows, all integrated, with this, complementary tools and solutions, because that's really, you need to get the best out of, the each, all right? So there's no need to just exclude one and go with the other. So definitely that's kind of thinking that, we are hearing from the most advanced organizations. Okay.
Arun, turning back to you, was curious, once upon a time, Apstra was only supporting EVPN, VXLAN reference designs. Is this still the case?
Good question, Terry. This is a question we often hear from folks who've seen Apstra before. So earlier, let me say, maybe a year back or before, But with the 4.1.1 release in September of last year, Apstra now supports free-form reference design. And with free-form, customers can build hub and spoke, ring, full mesh, and other topologies, leveraging any feature, protocol, or architecture that fits the deployment scenario. And now the network designer is responsible for creating and validating all device configurations. And as with other reference designs, Freeform still leverages the context graph, intent-based analytics, configuration validation, NOS management, time voyager, and other numerous Apstra software features.
That's great. Thank you for that. Gorkum, turning back to you, just wondering, with the research that you conducted, which segment do you think is most motivated about automating their data centers? And just curious why you think that is.
I don't think there's one particular segment that is, the most motivated, because for all segments, data center network automation is critical. I just talked about, all the 5G and edge, and all the industrial, 4.0 use cases. These all, very much reliant on data center automation. Maybe cloud service providers, they're slightly more motivated, because at the end of the day, data centers are their main business. But we've seen, some enterprises and CSPs that are as motivated as these cloud service providers. So it really comes down, to the individual organizations within these segments, how they think about automation and to what extent it is, incorporated in their strategy. Because, they're all facing, a range of technical challenges. We discussed them today. But a common characteristic, in the ones that we could say more motivated or committed are those the one that, putting also, the organizational and operational changes in place. Because, it's not just about technology, it's a full transformation. So those more motivated ones, they are already devising, long-term plans and roadmaps. They're getting support and sponsorships from their CTOs and CIOs. They're thinking about, how automation is going to redefine the staff responsibilities and job descriptions, and how they're going to, to allocate these resources to, to more strategic areas. So it is, I guess, it really comes down, to the specific enterprise and their, unique thinking. But, there are some common characteristics, when we look at this, bunch of organizations that are more motivated and more committed. So this is not a, coincidence. It really shows maturity in their thinking.
Sure. This feels like a great place to also address the Internet of Things. We were speaking about cloud and 5G just a few minutes ago. The predicted explosion of end devices that will be made network accessible, everything from thermostats to light switches to every operational technology piece out there, seems also poised to add to both the complexity and the required bandwidth for particularly enterprise needs. And Gorkum, I'm curious if you see this also becoming an issue for communication service providers, but it's abundantly clear that automation will be absolutely essential for managing what's exponential growth in the whole IoT sector of the industry. What are your thoughts there?
Absolutely. The sheer complexity of all the networks and the services, it's just becoming impossible to do it in a manual way. If you want to also, as an operator or as a service provider, if you want to, deliver these services in a cost-efficient way, in a competitive way, and also, a lot of people are, asking for on-demand and digital customer experience. So automation, it's not, something nice to have, but it's an imperative. Without that, you can't really deliver these services in the way that, they're supposed to be, definitely.
Gorkum, we have an audience member who's following up on the NetOps thread that we've been on during the Q&A session. This questioner is asking what you see as some of the main tools that would fall under the NetOps banner. They're citing existing tools like Ansible, Puppet, Python toolkits, or something else. And how maybe NetOps may differ from DevOps with regard to tooling. Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, definitely. So when we look at what's going on in data centers, and the networks team, they typically use scripting using, for example, Ansible playbooks are very common. So that's definitely a lot of network engineers that are using that. And also the Python, how they basically code in the networks today, it seems like the de facto the programming language. The agent-based tools, server and storage people, they tend to rely more on Chef and Puppet. But one of the interesting things that we found, one of the data center operations manager we interviewed, he said that initially, they all started with these, different tool sets, and everyone, specialized on one thing. But something that they started to notice is that they started to exchange, these tools and also their knowledge, their know-how. So, now that the networks people, they are starting to use, Puppet and Chef, even though maybe it was more server and storage people kind of thing, but it is, spreading into other areas. And also, I alluded this earlier, a lot of the networking resources, the DevOps people and the product owners, they want to consume these networking resources as a service, on demand. So they have to, integrate with the broader DevOps and the CI/CD pipeline environment. So it is converging, definitely. So maybe the networks people use more Ansible and Python a little bit more, but other tools are increasingly becoming adopted and used too.
Thanks for that. Arun, in the just a few minutes that we have left, you're in regular contact with customers across all of these segments that we've been talking about in the last hour. What types of data center operators and data center networks do you think are the best targets for the Apstra solution?
Great question there. So Apstra, just a general thumb rule is Apstra can be used across all data centers, enterprise, telco, edge data centers, multi-tenant or co-location, and hyperscale. So scalability is really an important consideration when you talk about the platform or the tool. And from the ground up, Apstra was designed for scale. I mean, our first customer, for example, Yahoo Japan, with its initial release, they actually deployed Apstra across their data centers with hundreds of switches. Now, of course, thousands, and in some cases, tens of thousands. We built the architecture from the beginning to fit the largest data centers so that we can scale with the customer as they grow the deployments. And since when we talk about scale, it has two directions, right? So on the other side, the smallest deployment that we can support with Apstra is what we call the collapsed spine, which is essentially one spine connected to two leaves. So in the nutshell, the operational model scales with the size of the data center, which is one of the key design goals of Apstra.
Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. My sincerest thanks to both Gorkum Yiyit with Analysys Mason and Arun Gandhi of Juniper Networks. Light Reading appreciates your time and expertise on data center automation and the smartest ways to handle that transition yourself. Thanks to our sponsor as well, Juniper Networks, as well as to everyone in today's audience. We appreciate you joining us for this Light Reading webinar, DIY Data Center Automation Deep Dive. Thanks for your attention and participation. We'll see you next time.